Hello everyone, my name is Jason, Legislative Chair for the San Fernando Valley chapter of the California Rifle and Pistol Association. Now, if you guys have been around any kind of Second Amendment or gun control discourse, then you've probably heard about the Founding Fathers' intent. What did the Founding Fathers actually think about the people and the militia as it's noted in the Second Amendment? What was the intention behind the Second Amendment in the first place? And does the Second Amendment guarantee that individual right to keep and bear arms? There are quotes all around the internet from George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, a bunch of different founding fathers, and today we're going to be talking about one particular founding father. As you guys have probably ascertained from the title and thumbnail of this video, we are going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson and the right to keep and bear arms and how he viewed it. Now, it's really important to understand your Second Amendment history as well. It's nice to share some quotes online from certain founding fathers pertaining to the militia and guns and the Second Amendment, but what is the true meaning behind some of these quotes? What did the founding fathers actually think about the Second Amendment, and what's their background with firearms altogether? With the Bruin decision from the Supreme Court, now we have lower courts that have to use historical precedent when analyzing a gun control measure in question in the courts. Although the historic analogs and analysis that you have to keep in mind technically starts at 1791 with the ratification of the Bill of Rights, it's still very important to understand the founders' intent even in 1776 and the years leading up to the Bill of Rights. And of course, we also have to go past the ratification of the Bill of Rights to see what other kind of historical analogs from certain founding fathers, presidents, things like that, can be used to analyze the Second Amendment and its history. So without further ado, let's start talking about Thomas Jefferson. Now, in order to understand Thomas Jefferson and what he thought about the right to keep and bear arms, we actually have to wind the clocks back to Jefferson's youth. Jefferson at a very early age was exposed to firearms and had to be proficient with a firearm because just at the age of 10 years old, his father, Peter Jefferson, would send him out into the wild to go hunting and told him, "Don't come back unless you have some game with you." This forced the young Thomas Jefferson to be proficient with his firearm, to understand it, and to learn that discipline at such a young age. Now, unfortunately for young Jefferson, he wasn't actually able to take wild game without some outside help. He found a turkey caught in a pen, shot the turkey while it was there, and dragged it home. But it shows that Jefferson was familiarizing himself with firearms from at least 10 years old. And this essentially stuck with Jefferson for the rest of his life. He was an avid outdoorsman. He was a hunter, a fisher, a horseback rider. I mean, he was always in nature when he had the chance. And because Thomas Jefferson was exposed to firearms at such a young age and it helped him discipline his mind, he definitely believed that young boys should have firearms to help discipline their minds. One of the best examples of this is when Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, the son of Dabney Carr, who married Thomas Jefferson's sister, Martha Jefferson, and Dabney Carr was a childhood friend of Jefferson, and, he basically considered him family, and then he became family after he married his sister, but I digress. In this letter to Peter Carr, he basically told him, "You should be carrying a gun when you walk." And at the time of writing the letter, Peter Carr was 15 years old, so Jefferson definitely believed in young men having firearms to discipline their minds. To quote Thomas Jefferson from the letter, "I advise the gun. While this gives a moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. Games played with the ball and others of that nature are too violent for the body and stamp no character on the mind. Let your gun, therefore, be the constant companion of your walks." So clearly, Thomas Jefferson supported the idea of carrying a firearm wherever you went, no matter the age. And needless to say, that means Thomas Jefferson owned some firearms himself. And as a matter of fact, at 25, Thomas Jefferson won a shooting competition with one of his guns. Jefferson once won a shilling 3 pence in a shooting competition. Makes me wonder what Thomas Jefferson would think of competitive shooting today. Jefferson was definitely a sportsman, not just with competitive shooting, but as a hunter as well. Isaac Granger Jefferson, one of the slaves at Monticello, painted a pretty clear picture of Jefferson as a hunter. He recalls that Jefferson hunted squirrels and partridges, kept 5 or 6 guns. Old master wouldn't shoot partridges settin', said he wouldn't take advantage of them, would give 'em a chance for their life. Wouldn't shoot a hare sittin' either, scare 'em up first. So Jefferson didn't like the idea of a literal sitting duck when hunting. He wanted to give them a chance. He wanted to track them with his gun and shoot them while they were moving. Now, before I go any further, I want to say, of course, the Second Amendment isn't just about hunting, despite what all the anti-gun activists say. And of course, hunting is a lawful activity protected under the Second Amendment, but I think it's very important to take a look at Thomas Jefferson and how he viewed hunting and his sportsmanship to see what Thomas Jefferson really thought about guns overall. Jefferson also liked to collect firearms firearms and have the supplies necessary to shoot his guns as well. Jefferson at one point in 1777 bought 12 pounds of gunpowder just for himself. And amongst Jefferson's collection were two 20-inch Turkish pistols, which he described that he never missed a squirrel at 30 yards with them. And later in Jefferson's life in 1816, he actually gave these pistols to John Payne Todd, who was Dolly Madison's son. Of course, Dolly Madison is the wife of James Madison, so that's what ended up happening to Thomas Jefferson's Turkish pistols later in his life. There are also historical records that Thomas Jefferson purchased miniguns and also had guns repaired. So far, we've identified that Thomas Jefferson was an avid outdoorsman, a hunter, a firearms collector, and believed that firearms can discipline the mind. But what about some of his legal work? After all, Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer, eventually a member of the House of Burgesses, an influential founding father who would go on to write the Declaration of Independence and eventually become the third president of the United States. Well, during the 1760s, Thomas Jefferson compiled what would be known as the Legal Commonplace book, a compilation of certain summaries, legal abstracts, things of that nature, and this really gives us an insight as to what Jefferson thought about legal practice. In his Legal Commonplace book on the topic of firearms, Jefferson included an excerpt from Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Let me know for you guys in the comment section that are either Italian or speak Italian. Let me know if I did a good job on that pronunciation. But in his Legal Commonplace book, it gives a really clear insight as to what Jefferson actually thought about gun control and gun laws. To quote Cesare Beccaria from Thomas Jefferson's Commonplace book, it says, "Laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage rather than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed one." And we see this reflected today in blue states and blue cities with the strictest gun control. They have some of the highest crime rates in the country. And Jefferson was well aware that when the people have arms, there is liberty. Beccaria was one of these Enlightenment-era thinkers that heavily influenced the Founding Fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others. You'll even see Beccaria cited in some Supreme Court opinions, so make no mistake, this Enlightenment figure was very influential on the Founding Fathers, influencing them on things that would eventually become the Bill of Rights. But staying on the topic of bearing arms, Jefferson was a staunch believer that no free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. Sound familiar? This quote is attributed to Thomas Jefferson because in his original drafts of the Virginia Constitution, he writes this down. Ultimately, this did not make the final version of the Virginia Constitution, but once again, this shows where Thomas Jefferson's head was at when it came to the right to keep and bear arms. And because Thomas Jefferson believed in a well-armed, well-trained citizenry, when he saw the damage that the Patriots were able to inflict at Bunker Hill with the mass casualties on the British side, he had this to say. Jefferson's quote about Bunker Hill says, "To our superiority in taking aim when we fire, every soldier in our army being intimate with his gun from infancy." Furthermore, in his correspondence with Edward Carrington, he highlighted his support for the importance of a citizen army. Jefferson wrote, "I am persuaded myself that the good sense of the people will always be found to be the best army." And on the subject of using arms is the topic of self-defense. You carry a gun that you hope you might not have to use it, but in the event that you do have to use it, you are ready and you are prepared. This is how Thomas Jefferson also felt when he wrote to George Washington in 1796. In his letter, Jefferson wrote from Monticello that one loves to possess arms, though they hope never to have occasion for them. A lot of responsible, law-abiding people in the United States possess firearms with the hopes that they don't have to use it. But it's always good to possess firearms and be well-regulated, meaning well-trained, with that firearm in the event that you do have to use it. And staying on the topic of self-defense, much later in his life, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in 1822 that once again shows his support for self-defense. In the book Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, historian and writer John Meacham highlights this letter where Thomas Jefferson endorses the idea of self-defense once again. From the book, it says, "He was a man of his time on the question of guns, writing in 1822 that, quote, every American who wishes to protect his farm from the ravages of quadrupeds and his country from those of biped invaders should be a, quote, gunman, adding, quote, "I am a great friend to the manly and healthy exercises of the gun." So once again, this highlights Thomas Jefferson's mindset and what he thought about guns. It helps facilitate self-defense, not just from animals attacking your farm, but the bipeds that are attacking your country as well. It reinforces the idea that a well-armed citizenry is the best way to deter tyranny and is the best form of defense for a free nation. And before we wrap up this video on Thomas Jefferson and the right to keep and bear arms, I would be remiss if I did not mention Thomas Jefferson's presidency. In his first annual speech to Congress in 1801, Thomas Jefferson highlighted the importance of a citizen militia being the army. To quote Thomas Jefferson once again, "Uncertain as we must ever be of the particular point in our circumference where an enemy may choose to invade us, the only force which can be ready at every point and competent to oppose them is the body of neighboring citizens formed into a militia." In his speech, Thomas Jefferson gave a full endorsement of citizen militias being ready at any given point if you have to defend the country from invaders. No surprise, considering many of the founding fathers were already very wary of established standing armies, and they believed that the citizenry, just the average person being well trained to arms, was sufficient enough to defend the country. The people are the militia. This is what the vast majority of the founding fathers and the founding generation believed. So in the event that any of these anti-gunners try to make you think twice about what the original intent behind the militia and the right of the people to keep and bear arms actually is, well, the history of the United States shows that the people were always in mind when it came to the militia. But staying on the topic of Jefferson's presidency, one of the major events that happened during his presidency was the Louisiana Purchase and the expedition of Lewis and Clark. Now, I want you all to remember this when the anti-gunners try to convince you that the founding fathers could never have imagined any of the technology we have today with assault weapons and high-capacity weapons and whatever kind of buzzword or term they want to use to try to dissuade you from exercising your right to keep and bear arms. Thomas Jefferson bought 2 Girardoni 46 caliber air rifles for Lewis and Clark to have on their expedition. The kicker? These rifles had a 22-round magazine tube. These rifles at one point were also used by the Austrian military. So what I want you to take away from this is that the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson were very aware of firearms that had a much higher capacity than the single-shot smoothbore muskets that were used in the American Revolution and other conflicts like that. Gun technology is and will always be ever evolving. So the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson were very aware of firearms with high capacity magazines, which are banned in many states today. So don't let these anti-gun activists convince you otherwise, that there weren't any guns with high-capacity magazines, or there were no assault weapons, which assault weapon doesn't have an actual definition. It's a made-up definition to try to instill fear in people, to try to get AR-15s and other modern, commonly owned rifles banned. There were certain guns back in those days that had different technology, and there weren't just muskets back in those days. This is just one example. So the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson were very much in support of privatized gun culture and people being well-trained and well-disciplined in the art of firearms. Jefferson believed that using firearms or carrying firearms gave you discipline, and any gun control measure that is restrictive does nothing to affect the criminals and only harms the law-abiding. Furthermore, the militia is comprised of the people, and that is a necessity if you want a free society. So the next time anti-gun activists try to talk down on this nation's history and try to dissuade you from exercising your right to keep and bear arms, tell them about Thomas Jefferson and what he felt about the right to keep and bear arms. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson on the right to keep and bear arms. I hope I was able to provide a sufficient amount of information about Thomas Jefferson, the history of the Second Amendment, and the history of gun culture in this video to help you learn more about Second Amendment history. And before I end today's video, I just want to say thank you to the thousands of people that tuned in to the Rody v. Bonta video from last week. I was not expecting that much support from the video. We had tons of likes and comments, and it was very unexpected. I was not expecting the video to do as well as it did. So once again, thank you to everybody who engaged with the video, and I hope we were able to inform you about that very important case. And thanks for watching this video. If you guys want to stay up to date with everything that the San Fernando Valley chapter of the California Rifle and Pistol Association is doing, subscribe right here on our YouTube channel, and make sure you follow us on our Instagram, linked down below in the description. Thank you again, and may God bless America.